Greetings, YouTube. I apologize if I coughed during the video. I am still recovering from COVID. Um, I'm a student of history. I got into history through D&D as I began to play the game, and I wanted to know about the actual backgrounds of some of the things that I was engaging in, the fantasy settings that were based on, the Middle Ages. So I began to read. And that led me to learn about castles, weapons, and the history of warfare. And then eventually I began to read about history in general, both the technical aspects of history. I have a wonderful affection for technical history, from stone tools all the way up through the latest research into like nanites and things like that. Um, but just history in general. And I eventually got around to reading American history, which I had found incredibly boring in high school. And it was a slapdash version of history anyway. It was not done in any kind of proper context. It was never done thoroughly. It was very much just propaganda. And because I was shown this version of history, it really put me off on it. But eventually I got around to learning some actual American history and the history of the science that has been so important to our modern era. And surprise, surprise, a lot of our history, a lot of scientific history, a lot of military history is really damn racist, is incredibly, unbelievably misogynistic. Flat out, much of the scientific history of the world has just ignored half the species. And history books written by Europeans have ignored the work of, the Arab scientists of the past and researchers, ignored the research done in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, has ignored anyone that wasn't a really white dude, that was all part of the, the good old boys club. And it's appalling. And as I read more and more history, I became to understand that there is just so much ugliness to it. And as I got more knowledgeable, I became more and more progressive. I also got really uncomfortable in the process, because that meant I had to face the reality that people that looked just like me had done everything they could possibly do to hide reality, to hide the contribution that women had made, and black people had made, and Asian people had made, and Arab people had made, to hide the history of what the American government has done to the indigenous people of this nation, of our actions in other countries. Look up the history of the phrase "banana republic" to see about our involvement in the Americas, Central and South America. And I couldn't view America through the same lens any longer, because I began to see America for its reality as opposed to the propaganda that I had been taught. And that is very much what we teach our students still to this day, propaganda. We have never confronted our racist history. We have never confronted our very much systematic attempts to eradicate the indigenous people on this continent. We have never discussed how we kept women in absolute subjugation for centuries. And then even after we granted white women the right to vote, even though they are the ones that fought for that, we didn't do the same thing for brown women and Asian women and black women and indigenous women. In fact, there were some situations where indigenous people were not even considered to be citizens of the United States of America until like the 1970s in some cases. And in fact, even today, it's hard for some indigenous peoples to vote because you can't use a P.O. box as an address. And in some of the reservations, that's the only way they get mail. So that disenfranchises them even today. Even though we can thank the indigenous peoples of America for their aid in helping Biden win in 2020. They were incredibly important um, in that election. Their efforts should never be dismissed or never downplayed. But history makes you uncomfortable. And if you aren't uncomfortable when you understand history, then you don't understand history. If you're a white person in America who understands history, actual American history, actual European history, actual scientific history, you're going to be uncomfortable because what we have done to the world is appalling. Now you're going to say, "Well, I didn't do that." No, you're right. You didn't do that. At least I'm hoping you didn't. But you've benefited from it. You've grown up with an inflated sense of self because you've only ever seen white people in the history books as the heroes, as the saviors of the world. You've lived in a world that had put you center stage with the spotlight right on you. And it's blinded you to the reality around you. So, yeah, you have to face that. It's ugly what we have done and how we ignore the world around us. And lots of folks don't want to do that. They don't want to have to unpack all the things that history and requires us to unpack to have an understanding. That's considered a negative. Lots of white Americans are terrified about their children learning actual American history. They are flat out. They don't want the kids to know that there have always been gay people and bi people, or don't want to know that there have always been trans people, and that gender has never been as hard coded as the conservatives would like you to believe. That lots of cultures view gender in a much different way than Europeans and Americans do. They don't want their kids to know that. They want their children to be ignorant, because within that ignorance, they can continue to push the narrative that the world they put forth is the correct one. And it isn't the correct one. It is an incredibly edited, tailored, structured fantasy. It is the ultimate example of a hothouse environment. They're terrified of letting their children outside of that hothouse, because if they saw the actual world, they may realize that they're just a player on that stage, no better than anybody else, and that they've benefited until now because they've been standing on a mountain of corpses. And maybe their kids don't want to do that. Thankfully, children are getting better at seeing the world for what it is. Social media, for all its ills, has also been very good at spreading actual information. And more kids are understanding that not everybody is straight, and not everybody is cisgender, and not everybody learns only a single language, and not everybody is white. And they're becoming more progressive, and in many ways becoming more socialist, because they see the failings of capitalism. And understanding of history is all part of that. So history is uncomfortable. And if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, then you're not actually learning anything. If you just read books about the golden era of American, those World War II, the best generation kind of thing, and the golden era of the 50s, which was only a golden era for a very select few in America, then you're not actually looking at history. You may think you are if you read a lot about World War II, you're very knowledgeable about every kind of tank that was ever designed or used. That's not a knowledge of history. That's knowledge of tanks. And I've encountered lots of people in my life that have thought of themselves as scholars when all they are is very knowledgeable, but about a very narrow scope of things. You need to know a lot about everything. Heck, if you only know a little bit about a lot of different things, that in and of itself will help. Because the more you learn, if you actually understand what you're learning, will help you to grasp that you know less and less. It's a bit of an irony, but you can keep trying, and you can keep broadening the breadth and depth of your knowledge. But you can't do that unless you're willing to confront the fact that history is uncomfortable.